everybody. Welcome to Skeleton Keys.
I'm Torri
And I'm John Booker.
And together we're going to try to unlock the mysteries of mythology and history in pop culture.
Ooh, today we are really going to go for it. We are really, really going to crack open history, myth, and you can't do that by yourself. You've got to have a partner in crime.
Yeah, you've got to. And we're going back to the OG partners in crime.
The OG partners in crime. We're talking today about criminal couples. We have to start, of course, by looking at the original criminal couple. If you come from a certain Judeo-Christian perspective, you know who I'm talking about, Adam and Eve.
Come on.
I mean, they rep criminal couples pretty great. They kind of set off the conversation, but Torri, they are by no means the only criminal couple throughout history.
You know, it's interesting in looking throughout history, how many couples are presented as criminal couples?
Yeah.
I mean, Adam and Eve, I don't think you can get more criminal than the fall of man and original sin.
Right.
I think you won.
You win.
In terms of, I guess, criminality and being the creators of that, or Genesis, if you will.
Hey, look at you.
Bible joke. But, I mean, you could even say my queen, Cleopatra and Mark Antony, are a criminal couple. It was very much presented that Cleopatra made him lose his head. That is actually the term they used. And she was this exotic Egyptian queen who stole him away from the Roman Empire and made his morals go lax. And they died in not the greatest fashion, which seems to be a trend.
You really can't get cooler than Cleopatra. I mean, as far as like setting the bar for archetypes go, I mean, she sort of, maybe I'm about to blaspheme here, but I feel like she in many ways is the original Queen Bee, Beyonce archetype.
100%.
Yeah.
100%. I think she is the most, she's controversial. I mean, especially back in her day.
Yeah.
But now you think queen, I think a lot of people automatically go Cleopatra.
Right.
I feel like that's the first name that's going to come up.
Well, it definitely is among historians. But what I love about this idea of criminal couples is we see it keep moving throughout history. Mm-hmm. We see the myth keep rising in the stories that we tell. Okay, going to put you on the spot here. What's your favorite criminal couple of like the last 2 years?
2 years? Like actual criminals?
No. Like story of criminal couples. Like, movie, book, TV show, something criminal couple from an archetypal point of view, like from a fictional sense.
Oh, okay. I guess I got to go Queen and Slim.
Yeah, you do. Yeah, you do.
That's it.
Well, it goes back to what you just said about Cleopatra. Mm-hmm. She's a queen. Queen. I feel like is queen. Oh, wow. Okay, now you're blowing my mind. Torri Yates-Orr, are you about to suggest to us that Queen and Slim is perhaps an archetypal projection of Cleopatra and Mark Antony?
I think there's a lot of things you can pull that say that. I'm just saying. There's a lot of similarities. There's a lot.
Okay. I cannot argue with you. You are 100% correct. There are a lot of similarities. They seem like Queen and Slim, just a great movie from that perspective. But also these characters in Queen and Slim, they're reaching back to something that we keep seeing, especially, I think, American culture become interested in. Because American culture became interested in Bonnie and Clyde. We've always been interested, I think, in criminals in general. But I think we especially become interested when criminals decide to team up.
Yes. And I think it's interesting, too, even in our terms of endearment. Yeah. Like, you're my ride or die.
Yeah.
That's a criminal couple reference.
Right.
Like, if we get into some stuff, you're my ride or die. You're my Queen and Slim. You're my Bonnie and Clyde.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting that we kind of venerate that as a high level of love for one another. I think that's interesting, especially in American culture, which is based on such puritanical values, that's seen as the ultimate expression of love.
You know what? You've really got me thinking about this now. Like from a psychological perspective, it's almost like if we're saying, okay, I'm willing to go outside of what is considered okay, and I am willing to bend the rules, and I am going to invite you to do that with me.
Yes.
And there's sort of something that I think we like about that, because we all love sort of the rebellious, again, the idea of criminality, but the idea, I think, especially of us not having to step into those waters alone, that we might have somebody that is willing to embrace that right along with us. Because, Torri, I know this is going to come as a shock to you, but I've been wrong a few times in my life.
Lies.
I know it's shocking. I know. But I also have done wrong things knowing I was doing wrong things. And I think that when I've done that, it's been a lonely path. So to have someone that's willing to say, you know what, I'm willing to go on this journey with you, even through those waters, that is a whole nother form of either love or at least a whole nother form of commitment. Like that's commitment.
I mean, it's like us against the world.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's what it is. It's like if you have someone who chooses to go down this path with you, they're choosing, yes, okay, the criminal aspect of it or the wrong aspect of it, but also accepting the consequences of that choice. And that's a huge deal.
Well, that's really an interesting thought, because honestly, the consequences probably are going to mean that you're not going to be together anymore. Like it's going to be death or prison or separation of some sort. So in some sense, it is like the ultimate commitment, because it's like, this is going to lead to my ultimate unhappiness of not being with you, but I'm willing to even go there with you. I'm willing to even take that adventure with you. And by the way, I'm not trying to condone criminality as this romantic notion of the ultimate love. It can only exist between criminals. It's not what I'm saying at all. But I think our psyches do want to know that even when we make wrong decisions, even when we choose the less popular path, that someone is going to accompany us on that journey and be there for us through that. And not just be there for us, but be right there doing the dirt with us.
Yeah. It's like a deep level of acceptance of the good and the bad in the moment.
Yeah.
Because that's all that really exists in that situation. Because like you said, it never ends well.
Never ends well. And maybe, so here, that's really, okay, I got to ask you, do you think anyone who's ever been in sort of this Bonnie and Clyde, Queen and Slim situation, do you think anyone ever believes it will end well? Because I feel like it's almost part of the archetype that it's like, it won't end well.
I think, honestly, that's part of the appeal.
You think so? Say more about that. How so?
To me, it's almost like a summer fling you're never going to see again. It's like this experience, I'm going to feel so much in this experience, but I know it can't last forever.
Yeah. Yeah.
And even this relationship, I know this can't last forever. We're going to be killed in a hail of gunfire like Bonnie and Clyde, or someone's going to lay on a sword like Mark Antony. Like it's not going to end well, but that experience and that choice between both of us knowing it's not going to end well, but we want to experience each other in that finite moment.
Yeah.
It's like I said, we're not condoning criminal couples, but it's almost a different kind of love of like, we know it's going to end, but let's do it.
Yeah. No, it's sort of that old saying of friends will help you move, but real friends help you move bodies.
It's real.
Yeah, it's that level of commitment. I think maybe that's even why the institution of marriage has been such a strong popular idea for years, is that commitment of till death do us part.
Yes.
We don't usually in happy celebratory moments like say, hey, let's also bring up death. Let's talk about death. I mean, that's a rare thing. I remember there's an episode of the TV show The Office where Dwight Schrute says that his people get married while standing in their graves. He said it makes the marriage ceremony a pretty grim affair, but the funerals are actually really happy lovely occasions. Yeah, it's just lovely. So,
do you think that the attraction to these criminal couples who burn really fast and really hot is because marriage is such a, like, everyone's supposed to get married. Like, that's the ultimate goal, that liking these criminal couples feels a little dangerous?
Oh, yeah, for sure. I think beyond just the sweet, positive side of the commitment of a criminal couple to make it through death, you think about the Adam and Eve story. It's in the story. And again, obviously, women get the really short end of the stick in this story as being the instigators of the problem, which we'll talk about for sure. But in the story, Eve eats the apple and then she offers it to Adam, who could have said, you know what? I'm not going to eat the apple. You're all on your own. See ya. But he's like, nope, you ate the apple. I'm going to eat the apple. And whatever the terrible consequences of this are going to be, we're going to face them together. And I think there is something that is kind of appealing about, like, let's go down in fire together on this thing. Yeah. And that is, by the way, not just a heteronormative concept. There was a great movie called Thelma and Louise where they're really just friends that, are these two women that become this criminal couple that, spoiler alert, but at the end, they drive their car right off a big cliff just to go down with the ship. I think there is something about that sort of ending to these stories, which in a sense avoids the consequences too. It at least puts the consequences for the actions back under the control of the criminal couple. They say, we're going to take our life rather than you taking our life.
That's exactly it. It's the control aspect of it. Yeah. Going out and with Thelma and Louise holding hands, going off that cliff, or hail of gunfire, or killing yourself. Like Cleopatra is, I get to choose this. You didn't dictate this for me. Yeah. And so much in society is dictated for us, including how our relationships are supposed to go and supposed to move along, that these couples are kind of off that spectrum. They're like, this is our choice. This is how I choose to live my life and choose to love.
Well, and we keep it real on this podcast.
Let's do it.
And I'll be honest, sometimes, I'm not saying this is good, but sometimes that sort of thinking is pretty sexy. And this brings us to our first segment where we take a skeleton from our own closet and we reveal it to the people. This podcast is called Skeleton Keys. We take a skeleton, we give it to the people from our closet, and then we give you a key, a resource later in the podcast. But let me just tell you, Torri, I've had a vast number of celebrity crushes during my tenure on this earth, but perhaps none were as powerful as the crush that I had on Winona Ryder. Now, Winona Ryder could just, you could just have a crush on Winona Ryder just for a number of reasons. But I had a crush on Winona Ryder after she was arrested for shoplifting at the Beverly Center Mall in Los Angeles a number of years ago. There was something to me about her, this sort of sweet, innocent woman, taking the dark path that I was like, oh, wow, that is really interesting to me. Now, from a psychological perspective, probably she was acting as a mirror for me. And I was, looking at myself saying, what would it be like for me to be able to take the dark path sometimes rather than always doing the right thing? So I'm probably, especially at this age in my life when this happened, I'm probably very much projecting onto Winona Ryder. But hey, that doesn't matter. When it comes to celeb crushes, why is not the point. But I had a brief time of fantasy about being a criminal couple with Winona Ryder, that she and I could just go do dirt all over the United States and be another little Bonnie and Clyde. Now, that was a pretty short-lived fantasy also because Winona Ryder was immediately arrested for her crime. And so I don't think she was very good at crime, but that didn't stop me from having a crush on her. And I'm embarrassed to admit that now. But criminal Winona Ryder, my celebrity crush for a small season of my life. There's a skeleton from John's closet. Torri, how about you?
That's powerful. And I do love, that's a choice. That's what I'll say. That's a choice.
Yes.
My skeleton will also be kind of one of those couples that it ended tragically. And younger Torri felt that she had a part to do with it.
Oh, young Torri.
Yes. Follow with me here.
Okay.
My first celebrity crush was Bobby Brown.
Oh, good choice.
Yes. I was a 4-year-old and I would carry his picture around so that he could see me. I thought he could see me. And when he and Whitney got together, I was heartbroken, very young, but heartbroken. And as we all have seen Bobby and Whitney together, I used to tell my parents that she was the bad influence on him. And at one point, I wished her dead.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, like that got real.
This story just took a really dark turn.
I know. And to this day, I feel awful about it.
Oh, God.
I was young and I was just like, you know what? She's the bad influence. No, but young Torri was very protective of her man. Oof. And I was like, she's the bad influence on him. Oof. So when she did tragically die, I felt a lot of guilt.
Oh, I'm sure.
Because I felt like I had put that out there. So This is about my judgmental, hateful self.
Wow.
Hating on that beautiful, crazy couple. That was Bobby and Whitney.
Well, we're going to do something historic here on the Skeleton Keys podcast. We are going to forgive young Torri for her prophetic and awful wish. You had no way of knowing. We have to forgive young Torri.
But why was I like 12 wishing that? That shouldn't have, I don't forgive myself.
Okay.
But thank you.
Wow. I got to say, I was not prepared for that skeleton. You brought it this episode there, Torri.
If you don't want to be friends anymore, I understand.
No. In some ways, again, my admiration level for you, which was already very high, has just went up even higher. This sort of brutal honesty about our skeletons is to be greatly admired.
Thank you. We're sharing here.
Absolutely. So I would love for us to, before we get to our interview, which I'm very excited about the guests that we have coming on the show, but I would love for us to talk specifically about some of the myths and archetypes and mythology of criminal couples. And here's the thing. We could do like an entire season of the podcast just on criminal couples and mythology. Now, let me sort of preface this by saying, I'm not saying specifically criminal couples like a couple that necessarily committed a crime against the state, like a legal crime. Mm-hmm. But oftentimes in mythology, it was crimes that were committed against the gods or crimes that were specifically committed against Zeus. And there's just so many to choose from.
So many.
So when I was thinking about which mythological couples we could talk about, first I thought, let's talk about Psyche and Eros. That would be fascinating. And then I said, no. We got to talk about Orpheus and Eurydice. That's where it's at. Orpheus and Eurydice. That's totally it. And then I said, no. Of course, we've got to talk about Paramus and Thisbe because, they're a precursor to Romeo and Juliet. And so we've really got to talk about them. And then it hit me. And I said, no. It's time for us to break out a deep cut. We need to break out the deep cuts.
Ooh, I'm excited.
Yeah. So I chose instead a myth that a lot of people probably are unfamiliar with, but it's a fascinating myth. And it's the myth of Alcyone and Ceyx. And for those of you who are trying to Google that, by the way, Alcyone is Alcyone and Ceyx is Ceyx. But Alcyone and Ceyx were the children of minor gods, but they were known in mythology as being super hot, super sexy couple. They were also super devoted to each other. They were all about each other. here's kind of where it becomes somewhat interesting. There is a particular version of the myth where they would do sort of a role play thing in the bedroom where they pretended like they were Hera and Zeus in the bedroom.
It's not going to go well.
Actually, in one version of the myth, they actually became Hera and Zeus in this role play in the bedroom. Well, Zeus finds out, and Zeus gets really, really upset about this. And so he summons a hurricane to drown Ceyx when he goes out to sea. And Ceyx, just before he dies, prays that his body would wash up ashore so that his wife, Alcyone, could bury him properly. And Hera hears the prayer of Ceyx, and Hera didn't mind so much the little bedroom game that was going on. And so she decides to answer Ceyx's prayer, and she sends Alcyone a dream to inform Alcyone of what's happened to Ceyx. And so upon waking up, Alcyone runs to the beach where she finds Ceyx's body has washed up. And after his funeral, Alcyone drowns herself out in the sea, unable to live without her beloved. So this couple's love for each other, it goes on to just amaze the other Olympians. And even Zeus later feels regret for what he's done, how he killed Ceyx. And he transforms Zeus. This is common with Zeus. Zeus often, he feels bad about something, so he decides to try and make it up later. And so he transforms Alcyone and Ceyx into kingfisher birds so that they can continue together. And to this day, there are kingfisher birds that are called Alcyone birds. And that's sort of where the name originates for these types of birds. So I feel like that criminal couple, because it's got the Romeo and Juliet stuff happening, but it's also got sort of this like bedroom role play crazy thing happening. It's also got jealousy with Zeus. And plus, I just like saying their names, Alcyone and Ceyx.
It sounds sexy.
It does, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, that was a couple that I wanted to make sure got a little bit of airtime here in our mythological discussion on Skeleton Keys.
And you know what's interesting about that story, and as you were telling it, because that's a deep cut I didn't know.
Yeah.
Is the role playing as the two main gods.
Right.
And it's interesting that you say that because a lot of times with criminal couples, even throughout history and in media, they take on a mythic character.
Totally.
And it's right there.
Yeah. That's, I guess, what's really interesting about this story to me. I mean, there's a lot of things that are really interesting, but I think it sort of cherry picks a lot of the elements about what makes criminal couples interesting anyway. It picks up on the sexuality thing. It picks up on this ultimate devotion to each other. It picks up on death, that one, I especially like that it's Zeus who basically kills Ceyx. So it's sort of this male jealousy thing comes into play. And then Alcyone ends up taking her own life. And it's sort of interesting when you hold this story up to other mythological stories. Again, Paramus and Thisbe, which is a precursor to Romeo and Juliet, it's got the whole family element there, which is missing in the Alcyone and Ceyx story. But I just feel like the story of Alcyone and Ceyx, it picks up more of these elements about what is psychologically fascinating about criminal couples than perhaps any of the other myths or stories. So I think, to me, this sort of serves as a really early archetype for what we would later see in these Bonnie and Clyde, Queen and Slim type stories. Sure, some of the facts and the elements change, but I also really like how the story ends, where the God changes them into these birds that can go fly away and live together. That there's sort of that ultimate hope that it speaks to when we see how a Bonnie and Clyde or Queen and Slim story ends. We kind of want to believe that there's still some future for that couple somewhere, somehow, in some dimension, right?
Exactly. You're always thinking like, well, at least they're together somewhere.
Yeah, absolutely.
At least they're going, even it's on to the next place or the next place that could be bad or whatever you believe in.
Right.
They're going to do it together because they live this life together. They live this moment together and they're going to fly away together.
I love it. I love it. And speaking of being together, we are about to be together with a fascinating guest. Our guest this episode is Brent Rodriguez Plate, and Brent is a writer. He's a speaker. He's an editor. He's a professor. He's actually the associate professor of religious studies and cinema and media studies. He is managing editor of Material Religion, the Journal of Objects, Art, and Belief. He's the president of the Association for Religion and Intellectual Life in Cross Currents. He is the author and editor of a lot of different books that include A History of Religion in 5.5 Objects and Religion in Film. You really should go read up on his work and what he's doing at sbrentplate.net, and we'll put that link in the show notes. But without any further ado, let's get into it with our guest, Professor Plate. Professor Plate, it is an honor to have you join us on Skeleton Keys. Thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thanks so much for having me. I really enjoyed the show. The first season has been great so far, and it's fun to be part of.
Well, we really appreciate it. And in looking and having you on the show, we were pretty blown away by your work. You have really invested in this conversation of religious studies and film and pop culture and spirituality and what we would term these larger ideas of myth. You've really been a leader in this conversation for a long, long time. Can you talk a little bit about what your initial interest in this field, in these fields was?
Yeah, sure. I began studying, sort of thinking in the realms of what we would call Christian theology, and thinking specifically in the sort of Christian realm. And it's one of these things, you start to travel, you start to meet other people who aren't quite like you, and you realize, hey, it's a little bigger than that. And got to travel, spent some time in one summer during my college years in East Africa, traveling through sort of the far outbacks of Kenya and meeting some Muslims there who just I had these encounters with Muslims. I had this chance to work with these Christian missionaries who really, they were kind of about helping people garden and helping water supply and things like that, and had these connections, had this chance to go there. So I was sort of thinking I was doing this sort of Christian outreach, but I met these Muslims there and they just sort of blew me away in their care and concern, and sort of thought, this is kind of interesting. And, from there, started traveling a little more and realizing, there's a little more to the world than this Christianity I grew up with. And from there, started to study it. And as I studied it, of course, even that gets bigger and bigger as you begin to read more and more. So between the traveling and the reading, just kind of began to ask larger questions about what is this thing? Let's call it, for me, the word religion works. It's not a perfect term, but it works for all kinds of reasons. Lately, for political reasons, it's been important. Right? It's right there in our Bill of Rights in the United States. So I'm willing to talk about that word religion. I think it's important because there are people sitting in detention camps right now because the United Nations has a definition of religion. They're not defining, I'm fine with the term spirituality, but it's not a political term. It has no political relevance to the United Nations, the United States. So I'm really interested in this term religion and how we can think about this in broad ways and get us to think, in a sense, what could this mean? What is it telling us about us as humans? I guess I'm a humanist in the end. And what is this thing telling us about these stories, this love of these great old stories that we keep retelling, that you guys are done so good a job of rethinking, who's our modern day Anansi and who's our modern day Aphrodite and people like that. Why do we keep retelling these stories? So maybe similar to you all's idea, just kind of begin to ask the questions about the stories, and all of a sudden you realize, this is bigger than I thought. It's not just a story. It's a little more in-depth and embedded in our lives.
That's incredible. When speaking of stories, you've written a book about religion and film and using that medium. Why do you think we see so many motifs from religion in certain films? Why do you think that's the medium that works so well with it?
I think in the first place, it's I could be sort of cynical and think, well, it's fodder. There's thousands of years of stories from West Africa and South Asia and East Asia and all over the world. So we can just pick and choose these stories. We've got so much story. We can just keep replicating these and keep turning them out, making new stories up from them. And I think that happens. I'm thinking of a name of a person. Well, let's call her Eve, right? Let's call them Adam, right? You sort of trigger these kinds of things. But I think there's more to it because I think film, particularly because it's audio-visual, my whole thing, let me back up a little bit. My whole thing, I think the book, as much as I love books, I mean, you can see the books here behind me. I love books. I love writing. But I also think the book as a sort of technological object may have done more to isolate us from each other than any other object. And I think they're technologically designed so that one person alone in silence can gather something. And I think that went a long way to our isolation from each other, our individuality. And again, as much as I love to be in a good book, and I almost always am in a few at a time, I think the cinematic experience came along at a time of really heightened literacy in Europe and the United States into the 19th century. And all of a sudden we had this communal event. We had this place where people gathered together and they saw things and they heard things and it was embodied and you felt it in your whole body. Not to say again, good literature, I feel it. I cry, I laugh when I'm reading, but I'm doing it alone. And in cinema, to sit there with a group of 100 other people and laugh together, I mean, that's just a powerful experience that I think has not been, or at least hadn't been replicated in the early 20th century in ways outside of religious traditions. Religion sort of had arguably some theater and various performance, but very often those were tightly, through history, those have been tied to religious groups as well. So this was this kind of new form of things that allowed people to be together, to have emotions, to be embodied, that the myth is not just on screen, but it reached out to us. We became part of it as we laughed, and the killer is out there and we're on the edge of our seats and yelling at the screen, no, don't go behind that corner, the killer's there, and as if the characters can hear us, but we're fully involved in it. And I think that's what this is the ancient history of myth. They were not meant to just be stories individuals had somehow possessed. They were told, they were acted out, they were performed. And I think cinema allowed us to kind of get back a little bit of that embodiment.
You brought up Adam and Eve, and of course, this episode we're focused on this idea of criminal couples in history and myth. And Adam and Eve, for some traditions, would be considered the first criminal couple. But we've seen criminal couples appear in history and myth throughout the centuries. And even, especially, I would say, in the last 100 or 200 years in pop culture and literature, in film and theater, we've seen just a fascination with these archetypes. Can you talk a little bit about Adam and Eve continuing to pop their heads into culture throughout the years?
Yeah, Adam and Eve are just huge. I mean, I think I might make the argument, I don't know how this would be quantified, but certainly one of the most enduring myths in world history. It just shows up again and again and again. I teach some segments. I teach a course in religion and pop culture, and I have students just think through all the ways that they've seen Adam and Eve. And first they think, oh, that's crazy. Nobody refers to Adam and Eve. And then they start looking and they realize it's everywhere and they find it all over the place. You've got great music throughout here. Great old Louis Armstrong song, Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve Had the Blues. And then into Elvis Presley's Adam and Evil, kind of a bit of a misogynistic sort of plays on that patriarchal stereotype of woman as the temptress. That sort of get one of the spillouts of this mythology is that the woman is the one who's the tempter. And Elvis Presley, there's a line in there, trouble is a woman, trouble here I am, is the line. It's sort of like, she's tempting me, but I'm falling for it. So it comes up again and again in these kinds of things. Contemporary artists, Damien Hirst, prominent artists around the world, Fred Tomaselli, this Adam and Eve story comes up again and again. I was watching, Good Omens, the TV show, Neil Gaiman, Pratchett TV show, right? It's played out there. Of course, The Simpsons, Family Guy, South Park, they're all referring to Adam and Eve. But then I think the sort of interesting parts too are things like, if I look in the back of my computer right now, right, is again, I'm back to that myth. It's the apple It's not just an apple. It's an apple that's eaten out of, right? And what does that symbolize? It symbolizes knowledge. I mean, according to the story in Genesis, that's the point of knowledge, right? You eat this apple, you will have knowledge. That was the temptation. So I don't know, Steve Jobs or who came up with the original logo, but it's a smart logo. This is, you've eaten the apple now, you've got knowledge. And now we've got this, here's the mythology on the back of hundreds of millions of computers around the world right now. That myth is right there in front of me every day on my computer. So it's amazing how much it's gone out and around. And I can go on. I just reading literature in this past year, I wasn't looking for Adam and Eve references, but in the past year, I've read the books. Neil Stephenson, a great sort of sci-fi speculative fiction writer, his book from a couple years ago called Fall, all kinds of references to Adam and Eve in it. Jeanette Winterson, great British writer, her recent book, Frankenstein, it's all about Adam and Eve throughout it. Lydia Millett's brand new book just came out called The Children's Bible. The main character there is Eve or Evie. So just constant references. Watch The Leftovers and HBO's Leftovers, HBO's Westworld, and then film, right? It's just again and again in film. And some of my favorite recent movies, Ex Machina, the robotic AI character is Ava. She's sort of in this sort of paradisiacal land, and it's a spin-off on the story, but it's clearly referencing that. And Tree of Life, a few years ago, Terrence Malick's Tree of Life. Then, of course, classics like All About Eve and things like that. National Lampoon did one, which I have not seen. I've seen it referred to, but I think I've got a poster image of it somewhere I showed my students, just Adam and Eve. It's national. You probably have to pay me a lot, I think, to watch that one, but... But anyway, it's there. So fascinating that it's just so widespread. And again, I tell my students, oh yeah, Adam and Eve, it's a pretty popular myth. And they're like a couple naked people and a snake in a tree. That's all they remember of it, all they know of it. And so it's maybe all you need to know at first. But you dig into it. And of course, just the biblical text. I didn't study Hebrew in any in-depth way, but I did study it enough to get into some of the details of the story in the original Hebrew, or not quite original, but as original as we have it. And it's fascinating. I mean, just poetic language throughout it, ambiguous, just playing with wordplay throughout it all. It's just not at all a straightforward story, full of complexity, full of things that just, sort of upset a lot of our ideas about gender relations, about sex, about temptation. And what would you do if you were stuck in a beautiful garden with nothing to do all the time except just not do that one thing? How many times would we keep eating that? If you push reset, I'd go back to the same apple, I'm sure, again and again.
Well, I mean, speaking of temptation, especially in examining these criminal couples and Adam and Eve, there's always that one moment of, are we going to do the right thing? Or are we not going to do the right thing? And that is always the focus and the kind of catalyst of all of these stories. Why do you think that resonates with people, that decision?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, it's sort of in the hero's mythology, right? There's the call to adventure, right? You sort of have to kind of stop, really hesitate for a minute, maybe seek some advice from an elder or someone else, figure out. But I think, as you said, Torri, I think it's that choice, right? I think it's sort of it's not just accidental. We've actually made a conscious decision to go through with this. We've thought about it. So it's not just an impulse, but it is a little bit of an impulse. It's not just sort of a rational choice idea, but it is a little bit of that as well. I think maybe, again, it's a holistic kind of thing. It's trying to appeal to our head and our heart at the same time. And so that hesitation might be part of that head part, that rational part, that I thought this through. I weighed the options and now I'm going to eat. Now I'm going to do this thing. I think that might be part of it anyway, some sort of deliberation, especially if that involves asking advice of others. Some sort of, ultimately the individuals might have the responsibility, but some connection with other people.
When I think about the myth of Adam and Eve, and then I think about any sort of criminality, I can't help but also, especially as you talked about, the gender issues that are at play in this, I can't help but think about Lilith. And Lilith is, I think, a fascinating character in mythology. Does your work and your examination of Adam and Eve ever deal with this character of Lilith?
It sort of doesn't. I mean, to be honest, it's kind of gone there in certain times, and I think it's key. And I always have students write some pieces sort of based on that. But I always just sort of keep coming back. I get sort of all consumed with just the kind of the dyad, the two of Adam and Eve. I mean, I think the sense of maybe a do-over or the rewriting element of it, I think is interesting and significant. That there are it's pointing to the idea that there's always another story. There was one before this. Movie like The Matrix, right? You sort of find out some way into The Matrix that this wasn't the first one. They tried it before and they tried it several times and it keeps not taking. Or the TV show, The Good Place, right? They have to keep trying this out to make it work. And I think in some ways, without getting into the Lilith character herself, but it's something about, I think, that sense of restart and reboot that is kind of significant there. And there's sort of let's try the story again. They try to write this one out a little bit. I think is significant. I'm really interested in the kind of retellings, and this chance to start over again.
Yeah.
But there's always something left over. Something's not totally erased from the previous.
Yeah. We are thinking in this episode a lot about some of the modern criminal couples, the Bonnie and Clyde. Last year, the movie Queen and Slim. It always seems with criminal couples, there's something that each individual brings to that equation. When I think about the Adam and Eve myth, I often think Eve is the far more interesting character to me, in that she's willing to go out on the limb and take the chance and let's break out. And Adam is he's a wuss. He's kind of like, oh, we can't do that. And I don't know. Do you think in some ways we could say, well, the Adam and Eve myth really makes Eve out to be this really horrible character. It makes women look bad, and it does. But it also makes Adam in some ways look like this. I'm just not interested in Adam in this story. Can you comment on that?
Absolutely. Yeah. No, Eve is by far the more interesting character. Even the snake, the two most God and Adam are a little kind of, they're a nice background, sort of B-roll stuff. But the snake and Eve, that's where it happened. That's the thing that's going on. And I think Eve is just much more interesting. She's finding out, she's learning, she's getting to this point of knowledge, and there's this questioning, it's not in-depth dialogue, but there's this sense that there's some conversation going on, deliberation. She seems to be thinking about it, whereas Adam's just kind of like, oh, okay, no, we're not supposed to do that. But here, I'll eat it anyway. So the Eve character is fantastic there. And that's one of these things of this story. It's just so much more complex. The gender dynamics are so much more complex through it all. And in ways that, of course, the English translations, and this is true for most European languages anyway, of the translations of this are, seem to be more about, here was this man born first and then this woman comes after. And the Hebrew is much more ambiguous for all that kind of stuff. And Eve is just, much more, even again, it's not a long story, but even in that shortness, she's much more interesting character through it. Yeah, it's fascinating. Because this is where the questions are, because it's driven by questions. And she's sort of the original question asker. There is no Apple computer without this. You need knowledge. How do you have knowledge? You ask questions. Eve is the gateway to knowledge.
I was actually going to ask what Adam and Eve can bring to people in the future. Is it that quest for knowledge? Is that curiosity that we need, that we still need the story of Adam and Eve?
Yeah, I think it may be two things. I think one, it's that quest for knowledge. This something seems to be innate. I think the ancients who were first kind of telling these stories, something in humans that was inquisitive, that needed to reach out, that needed to create new technologies, that needed to understand the world around them. And this was a great sort of embodiment of all that kind of stuff. On the other hand, I think one of the other things that it tells us maybe too is that what is the paradise that we're all in? What is the garden that we're all in? And why do I keep eating that apple? Or the fruit, right? Again, the apple, we sort of, for various reasons, got this idea it's an apple, but it's not really. There's nothing. Maybe a fig tree, probably some of the sort of surmise, some people working on these kind of things suggest that if it was anything, it was a fig tree back in that part of the world, that time would have been a fig tree. But we've all got a garden. Why do you keep eating that fruit, that one thing you're not supposed to be doing? Why do I return to this thing again and again? I know that's going to mess me up. And I keep, in a sense, having this garden. I mean, our gardens, of course, look different. I'm not saying we've all got paradise around us. It's not that. But we keep sort of veering off. And why are we doing this? What is our connection? How am I learning about the world? So I think in some ways, those are at least two of the different things that are relevant to us. One is, again, question asking. The other is this, what is our garden and what is that fruit that we keep picking, each of us individually?
You mentioned the snake being one of the more interesting characters in this story. And obviously, there's a treasure trove of mythological connections to snakes and, the Ouroboros and the shedding of the skin and all these different mythological motifs and tropes. It seems to me one of the most interesting aspects of the snake that those who would take this myth literally never seem to question the fact that the snake can talk. And that, to me, would be the first indicator that this is a myth, that's very common in fables and mythology and fairy tales, would be talking animals. But I never hear a lot of discussion on the fact that, I get Satan took the form of a snake, but Adam nor Eve never seemed to be very surprised that the snake talks. And to me, that would have been the thing that really caused me not to eat the apple, is I would have been so disturbed by a talking snake that the apple would have never even been a factor for me. So, Professor Plate, can you address the talking snake?
Let's address it's like the 800-pound gorilla in the room, right? Let's address the talking snake in the room, in the garden. It's an amazing sort of, and had legs too, seemingly walked around on legs and talked. So a very different idea of obviously the contemporary snake that doesn't do that. And seemingly other animals were around, they were there and had this chance to name these animals. So certainly there were others there. It doesn't indicate whether any of these other animals talked or not, but seemingly this was a special animal that did. But it is a bizarre part of it. And then part of the curse is it loses its legs. It has to crawl around on its belly. And so part of the curse is that it lost this sort of special status, became something feared by people and interesting reasons, right? I mean, you guys were talking about Anansi, right? Last season, and this sort of sense of the spider, this is very kind of reviled animal, right? Across human cultures, there's reason for it. I mean, they can bite us, and there's some pretty poisonous ones that can kill us. And the same with snakes. There's a reason we're kind of afraid of them. And I see them. I live out in the country, and I saw three snakes this morning. They're just little garter snakes.
John is shaking his head in disgust.
Nope, I couldn't do it.
Pick them up, sort of move them out of the way. They're fine. They become friends of ours, and make sure they're out of the house, but doing their job. But there's this kind of, my eye has been trained in a certain way that I can see it, like my peripheral vision. I can see a snake. There's sort of all kinds of stuff in my visual field. There's a snake off to the side, and it's like my mind is trained to see that. There's something deep seated in our human eye. I'm not sure how we figure this out, but it'd be interesting, deep seated in our human DNA that has the ability to see snakes, see these little figures. And the snake is, fascinating. And as you mentioned, it's cross mythologies, we find snakes in different forms, most parts of the world. And often they're dangerous figures. Many parts of the world, these things will kill you very quickly. And even where I live, and actually feel in Southern California, plenty of snakes there before humans showed up that would kill you. And we did a good job of chasing them all out, for better or for worse. But
still find their way back.
They still find their way back. Yeah. I grew up in Southern California, and rattlesnakes were not uncommon. Garages and backyards, and still. So anyway, I think the point here I think I'm trying to get at is that myths come from these shared material embodied experiences. We know what snakes are. We know that's the little catch. I think part of the little catch in the story. Okay, I can picture here's a male creature and a female creature, a man and a woman. But then it's like, there's that point where there's the talking snake. I can picture a snake, but you got me as a reader, you got me as a listener that, this is kind of interesting. Yeah. It's not just a couple people in a garden. There's a talking snake. This is 10 times more interesting than what I thought I signed up for. The myth is the ability to take these common everyday things and then turn them a little bit. Just twist something a little bit, right? I mean, like any good piece of literature, a good film, it's just something that catches our attention, makes us a little bit more about it.
Well, I have one more question, and then Torri will wrap us up with the last question. But from a mythological perspective, we have this innate desire to explain the phenomena of the world, as you mentioned. And certainly early humans must have wondered why there's pain in the world, why there's problems in the world, why there's suffering in the world. And the question of suffering, of course, is one of the oldest theological and religious questions and continues to be today. I think one of the most relevant religious questions is the problem of suffering. Do you think the myth of Adam and Eve is a sufficient myth for trying to address that problem of suffering and trying to deal with that issue? And maybe it was an applicable myth for a long time that addressed that issue, but sort of deconstruct that just a bit through the lens of that answering the problem of suffering.
Well, right, on one hand, certainly the Christian church took this myth and sort of played out this idea of original sin. And there's this easy answer. Why do you suffer? Well, you're doing something wrong and you're sinning because it's part of your DNA. And it goes back through the generations. And here's the original sin. That's somehow sort of planted into the generations by this original sin. And that it works in a power structure, right? Myths are wonderful. I love myths. I love reading myths, but of course they're always bound up with power structures, with nations and ethnicities and genders. You can't not talk about all these other issues of power throughout it. So they're condensations of power. Who gets to tell the story and who gets to retell the story more importantly, and how does that sort of retelling change according to who's listening over time? So I think the sense of suffering, it has a way of social control. Certainly, things are bad. What did you do to make it that way? What was your part in being a sinful creature? Why do you keep eating that apple? Suffer because you deserve it, right? And so, that's certainly one religious response that goes back to this story. Why suffering happened? Well, you made it happen, right? You deserve it.
Cheerful
stuff. Yeah, really exciting. I think if you want to rescue it, you sort of think, it makes people try to do better in the world. But I think there may be other ways to do that as well. That might be more healthy and good for our psyches. So, I think it's had that chance. But of course, it has to be kind of retold and reified in different ways. So you find it coming back up in pop culture, certainly, but in ways to sort of justify certain, right? There's the sort of a conservative Christian approach that sort of says, well, it was Adam and Eve and it wasn't Adam and Steve, right? It sort of, this is the justification for heterosexuality as being the normative sexuality, is that here's the mythology about it. There was one man and one woman. It wasn't two men, it wasn't two women. This is what it was. So always bound up with these power structures. But of course, it's both sufficient and that can be retold, but it's also insufficient because, right, we keep asking questions. We keep looking for that apple. We keep wanting to know more. And then the questions and myth doesn't hold up. And so it has to be kind of revamped and retold in various ways. As you guys know, this is the malleability of myth, the adaptability of it. The reason that talking about a story that's maybe 4,000 years old, 3,000 years old, if there are any specific origins to it at all, that's a long time. That's human terms. That's a pretty long time. And we keep retelling it. We keep talking about it again and again. So the power is in the retelling. And who's in control of the retelling, I think, is really the key kind of questions to ask, is who's got access to that telling and the retelling? What are they after? What are the retellers after? Keep asking those kind of questions.
And speaking of the structure that the story is told in, and I think we both found that with criminal couples, you find yourself rooting for them. They could be doing awful things, but you're like, man, I want them to get away. Which is kind of the opposite of how we feel in terms of the original sin and all. Why do you think that is? Why do we root for these two people in love that we know are doing heinous things?
Yeah, I think part of it might just be the underdog, or sort of this human predilection for underdogs. We know Bonnie and Clyde and Thelma and Louise aren't going to survive. We sort of know that's going to happen. We know Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid aren't going to make it. They're too much of an underdog, but we're going to root for them as much as we can along the way. And I think there's certain, again, I'm not sure I'm compassionate with Adam, but I'm certainly interested in, as we mentioned, interested in Eve, very, very interesting character. And certainly if it was a longer story, I would certainly cheer Eve on. And if they could make a little more complex backstory for Adam, that would be that would be one thing. Which of course they do in these longer stories, and Queen and Slim and all the rest. They're just fast. And of course, how can you not like Paul Newman and Robert Redford? Which can't? I mean, just look at them. They're just beautiful people. Why would I not root for them, right? I mean, Hollywood, right? Pretty simply does this by just putting good-looking characters on screen. How can you not root for this guy? I know he's a bad guy, but man, he's got nice eyes.
That's the key.
Right? So we got to find these enduring. I mean, this is what cinema has done. Is it's the face. It's all about the face in cinema. That just the face sells, and as always, and great critics have waxed eloquent about the faces of various stars and seeing them 10 feet tall on the screen, and that's the power of it all. And so, so it's partly that, but I think it's, again, back to the thing, I think it's partly the underdog. We want the kind of scrappy question-answer asker, the one who's kind of willing to not just accept things as they are, but throw a little wrench in the works and upset the balance, upset the order of things. This evening, this is nice, this is fine, but what else can we learn about this? Just something, we don't like equilibrium too much. We don't like harmony. Is be nice if we could all get along and harmony happen, but it just was, we also like disorder too. I think it's part of our, we can't have too much order. So there's a balance. Certainly sometimes too much chaos is difficult, and we need to restore order in various ways, but we can't have too much cosmos either, too much order in the world. We need to poke around at things. Because it's usually never, you look behind the scenes and it's never quite the Edenic environment that we think it is. It's usually, I always had the sense growing up, thinking about the story of Adam and Eve, that there was just kind of like this garden, and then there was something, I mean, as the story says, there's something east of Eden, right? Something beyond the garden. I always wondered, were there walls there? Because the biblical text doesn't say that, but I just sort of had the sense that it was like this really small garden in the middle of some big desert or something like that. And I always thought, why would you not go out beyond it? Just why did you have to wait till the curse and the fall to be punished and pushed out beyond it? I would have wanted to go beyond it right away. And again, that's what Eve is doing in her own kind of way.
Well, Professor Plate, thank you so much for being on our show. If people are interested in following you and following your work, and if you have any new projects coming up people should watch for, tell us where we can more deeply engage you in your work.
Yeah, I'm on Twitter and have a website as well. You can find me at Hamilton College in upstate New York, and I'm at Hamilton College. I'm currently working on a new book on the spiritual life of dolls. So looking at how dolls show up in, again, kind of cultures around the world. They show up in myths and rituals and movies, and how we use dolls and how we're used by dolls, how dolls teach us things, teach us, again, about gender. They teach us about social norms. They teach us to grieve. They teach us to be happy and be sad, to pray, things like that. So I'm writing a global history of the spiritual life of dolls right now.
And of course, we'll include links to follow you in the show notes. Thank you so much for being a part of the show, and we can't wait to see what you do in the future with myth and history.
Great. Thanks, Torri. Thanks, John. Great to talk to you all. Great show you got going.
Thank you.
Wow. Professor Plate bringing the knowledge. Incredible. Torri, he talked a lot about these different stories that have come down through history, but his expertise around Adam and Eve is especially interesting to me. What do you think of when you think of Adam and Eve? Is it just a story you heard when you were little? And I don't know if you went to Sunday school and heard this story, or what do you think of? Like, what comes to mind for you when you think of Adam and Eve?
It's interesting. Even in Sunday school, which I did attend, I remember thinking there's something titillating about the story of Adam and Eve. There's something just the two naked people, fruit, a snake, Like, even as a child, I understood that these images and these symbols represented something that was a little adult to me.
For sure.
So even as a kid, I recognized that there was something a little bit dangerous about Adam and Eve.
You're exactly right. I mean, the story's got sex, fear, eating, and death. It boils it down to the human essentials. I had that same reaction, though. I remember when I was little having like a little children's Bible book that had a picture of Adam and Eve. They've always got the discreetly placed leaves over Adam and Eve's more human characteristics, shall we say. And I think I remember the first time that I learned, no, they were naked in the garden. And it was like, oh.
How old were you when you had that realization?
I was still pretty young, but I just remember that feeling like, well, this story just got a lot more interesting to me, because you're so visual, especially when you're a kid, that you see this image and it's like you filter the story through the image that you saw. And like the one that I saw, Adam like had like leaves not only over his manliness, but but also he had sort of like a Tarzan over one shoulder leaf thing that made like a leaf clothing. And Eve was wearing like a leaf bikini. And so, it was like, oh, okay, this is, but then it's so funny, because they can't really tell the full story, because part of the thing is that Adam and Eve recognize that they're naked and that they sew clothes and put on the clothes. But, I get also you may not want to drop the heavy material on the children, But I think that speaks to, I guess what I'm trying to get at is that speaks to, in many ways, the adult nature of this story. Just like you said, the titillating adult nature of the story. In some senses, this is not just a story for kids. This is really a pretty adult story.
And the fact that it's the genesis of so many Judeo-Christian stories is interesting to me.
Yeah.
That this very sexual story of temptation and fear and sin is the beginning. That's the first, human story we hear.
For sure. We always like to ask towards the end of the episode, do we think that the connection to the myth is this intentional connection? Is it subconscious? When we see like a Queen and Slim, a film like this, or Bonnie and Clyde, pick whatever manifestation of it you like. Do you think the creators of these modern projections of this are thinking about Adam and Eve, or do you think it just operates on a subconscious level?
I think it's subconscious, but it's not necessarily Adam and Eve as the characters as we know them, but it's a connection to who we were before the world got to us.
Yeah.
Who we were at the very beginning before we felt shame or before we felt this is the way we have to do things or felt bad about things. How would you love? How would you move forward with someone that you're in love with your partner? If you didn't have all of these things, if you had a Garden of Eden, how would you move forward? And so a lot of these criminal couples, the true romance, the natural born killers, all of those, Queen and Slim, is how are we going to move forward even though we've done these horrible things? How are we going to move forward without shame? So I think in that way, you can see a connection to them.
Totally.
What about you? Do you think it's conscious?
I would side with you. I don't think it's necessarily conscious, but also I think if you approach the writers of Queen and Slim or Bonnie and Clyde, obviously Bonnie and Clyde's based on historical people and historical events, but let's take Queen and Slim. I don't think the writers would be very surprised to have the Adam and Eve connection. I don't think they'd say, oh, I never thought about that. I think they would embrace that connection to the archetypes, but I don't think it was front and center in their thinking. And that's sort of the way archetypes work. I mean, probably depending on what you believe about archetypes, many believe that archetypes are part of the universal expression that existed long even before human beings, and that the story of Adam and Eve would just be another story that is designed to express this archetypal idea that existed before we even had an Adam and Eve story. So I think a lot of it depends on where you come down on these archetypal expressions and ideas. But I don't think it's conscious in this case. But I also don't think, again, that the creators would be at all surprised. Yeah.
No, they see that beginning right there.
Well, and speaking of surprises, I just believe you have a surprise skeleton key for us. Do you have a key that is going to surprise us this week, or what do you have for us?
I do. So in doing research on criminal couples, I started reading up on real life criminal couples. And if you guys are not aware, that can get very dark very fast. And the first couple that I read about was the Lonely Hearts Killers in Los Angeles. And they met a lot of their victims through the Lonely Hearts ads. And so I started reading those ads.
Wow.
Just because... Yeah, I kind of started looking them up back in the day. And we even had classifieds not too long ago where people would ask for what they're looking for. And so it made me sympathize. In a number of criminal couples, especially in real life ones and not fictional, one person is typically more manipulative than the other. And reading these Lonely Hearts ad, which is how Raymond met Martha, they were the two who were the killers, you can see how easily people can be manipulated into doing criminal things or not morally right things because everyone wants to feel accepted. Everyone wants to feel like they're a part of something. And reading these ads, you're like, oh, I can see how people would meet up with someone, or because everyone's looking for that acceptance, for that ride or die, for that deep love. And so Lonely Hearts ads, if you guys can read them, I think you can get a lot of insight into how some of these couples came to be.
You just delivered there. That does surprise me. I did not see that coming. Wow, that's fascinating. I'm going to go look that up immediately after this episode. That's amazing.
What about you?
I have probably a more obvious key this week, but often I recommend a book. And this episode, actually, I'm going to recommend a musical. And I saw it last year on Broadway, and it blew my mind. It was so good, but I was late to the party. Many people who are into Broadway musicals were already very aware of this musical because it won like all the Tonys for Best Musical and Best Original Score. And it's the musical Hadestown. And it is the story of Orpheus and Eurydice, where Orpheus goes to the underworld to rescue Eurydice. And it is set in New Orleans, in sort of jazz era New Orleans. And the music is unbelievably great. The dancing is unbelievably great. And I just love to see modern expressions of myth anyway, but this one is just especially good. It's created, the music, lyric, and books by Anais Mitchell, who is like a folk singer. She's brilliant. She's amazing. She's wonderful. But you really owe it to yourself to try and see it live. Although depending on when you're listening to this, live productions may or may not be a thing that you can attend. And if you can't, then go to Spotify or Apple Music or wherever you get music and listen to the soundtrack, because the music is just tremendous. And sometimes the best keys that we can offer each other don't just feed the head, but they feed the heart and they feed our souls. And for me personally, there is no better nutrition for my soul than music, and music that has deep purpose and meaning. Trying to describe why music is powerful or means something to us would take a whole nother episode, or at least. But I really believe that this quote unquote criminal couple of Orpheus and Eurydice, a lot of these ideas we're talking about and the discussion that we're having, it comes through in so much of this story. And spoiler alert, there's another criminal couple in this story that is fascinating. And it's the expressions of Hades and Persephone, who, of course, ruled the underworld. And so I feel like Hadestown has multiple criminal couple expressions. And I highly, highly recommend it.
I have to see it.
Oh, you really do.
Hopefully.
Really.
One day.
One day. It's really worth your time. If it comes to your city or you find yourself in New York, don't miss Hadestown. Torri, this has been a really, really entertaining chat for me around this idea of mythological and historical criminal couples. Wow, I learned so much just listening to our own podcast.
I know. I always learn a lot just like listening to you. I'm like, oh, I didn't know that. Or I didn't think about it that way.
Well, and that's my favorite part of the podcast is learning from the wisdom of Torri Yates Orr. And I'm sure all those listening would agree with me on this.
Hopefully they are. Hopefully they're following along and leaving us reviews on iTunes.
That would mean the world to us. It would just mean the world to us if you would leave us a rating and a review on iTunes. That's how people find this podcast. That's how others can discover us. And this week, I challenge you, share our podcast with a friend that you think may be interested in this type of material that we're doing. We would love, love, love to see the listenership continue to grow. And as it grows, we hope you'll reach out to us and say hello. Torri, where can they get a hold of us?
You can always shoot us an email at skeletonskeys@gmail.com. We'll be there waiting for you. You can also follow us on social media at Skeleton Keys Pod. That's on Twitter and Instagram. And you can follow us personally on Twitter and Instagram and wherever social exists. My handle is at Torri Yates Orr. That's TorriYatesOrr.
And you can follow me on Twitter at John, JohnKBucher, or on Instagram at Telling a Better Story. That's it for us this episode. We hope to see you next time. This has been Skeleton Keys.
You've been listening to the Skeleton Keys podcast with Torri Yates Orr and John Booker. Skeleton Keys is a production of Sideshow Media Group.